Hi, thank you so much for joining us for this series of illustrated conversations entitled StillLife. StillLife is a series of 10 illustrated conversations between Nature Morte artists and me that takes this time of stillness to consider a theme constant across an artist's body of work. This series will take a short text, such as a piece of poetry, short story, or the lyrics of a song, selected by an artist as a conceptual guide to navigate across their diverse bodies of work, considering why the artist still returns to this source of inspiration across dynamically changing times, and why this concern is still relevant today. Of course, this title is also a play off the word Nature Morte, which also means still life. One of the problems I grapple with is that sometimes the persona or personality of the maker can be too present in these days of social media and branding, and it has the potential to eclipse the work and the ideas on the table. We want the work and the ideas behind it to live far beyond us, so Jitish and I took a conscious choice that we want artworks to illustrate the words and ideas that are exchanged between us here. So without further delay, I invite Jitish to read the poem that inspired him to prime the rest of this conversation. Hi, Jitish.
Hi, Diana. First of all, Diana, that's a beautiful title. This peculiar moment of stillness, and I think for me to choose this, these poems, it wasn't really a choice that came with much thinking. It was really a kind of sequence of thoughts when I received your mail regarding the idea, and it also felt like there's this peculiar kind of stillness that we are going through at this moment, where one can almost think of it as kind of like an inertia of sorts, right? I mean, we are kind of pulled to a halt. It's almost like the bus is pulled to a halt, but every passenger in the bus, has hit whiplash, and the bus looks still from the outside, but from the inside it's a peculiar moment of turbulence. So I think there's this stillness that encapsulates a sort of dimension of turbulence at this moment, and while sort of receiving your mail, there was this I've been thinking of Apollinaire quite a lot at this moment, and his calligrams, his sort of text poems in relationship to some drawings I was doing, and almost as a stream of connections, I suddenly thought of this poem that's often misattributed to him, but is written by someone else. So it's a short 7-line poem by Christopher Logue, which many of you may have read in the public domain. It's sort of widely circulated, but I thought allows us to bring in a certain image into our conversation, the image of the edge. Come to the edge. We might fall. Come to the edge. It's too high. Come to the edge. And they came, and he pushed, and they flew.
Beautiful. And Jitish, when I think about these 10 years that we've known each other and all the things we've tried to do, I feel like we're always pushing different edges, like be there geopolitical edges, material edges, deadline edges, time edges. But, that feeling when you fly past that limit is such a feeling of exhilaration. And what I loved about our conversation last week was when you were talking about how you thought it was that edge of the unknown, like that edge in that space between what you know and what you can't fathom, and that being the place where art happens. But could you share a little bit more about that line of thinking?
Yeah, absolutely, Diana. In fact, when you read the poem, of course, it seems like, it's hovering in that space of creative hesitation and liberation, that doubt, this thing between fear, fall or fly, which is a companion to all our creative processes. But I think the edge to me, in a particular sense, that I read these words, is really the edge of, unknown world, our own knowledge. And how often this edge is really the portal in some ways, the portal through which one might have any hope of insight, and this precipice, the perimeter of the known is really the place of art. That's where we can hope to find art. We can hope to find the questions that create art, or that allows us to get to the studio the next day. And so in some ways this edge is really this space of the known and the unknown, this little filament, which is equally a cliff, is a daunting space. But what's probably even more daunting is those times when you don't find the edge, and we are all quite familiar that we can circumnavigate our own little private planet and never find an edge. And to me that space of the edge, and as you and I have also known through our conversations, is really something that we seek. Then you might fear, and then you might fall, or then you might fly, and these possibilities are what you move between. And I think I'm really grateful to you that this long forgotten 8 or 10 lines really emerged in my head out of a stream of thoughts, really, within minutes after our email exchange, really.
Yeah, totally. And even since our email exchange, I feel like we're at a time where the world is on edge. I'm on edge. I don't know if you're on edge, but this thought about what do we refuse to take anymore, right? The amount of protests in the last 10 days, just seeing that people are ready to go off the edge for what they believe in. And anyway, I think that this poem was a very you've always kind of been ahead of your time or stretching time, but it's very timely.
The peculiar thing about this moment is this, also this contrasting geometry, of the problem. Because, if we think of, inertia as the situation where, objects remain at rest or, uniform motion until they are acted upon by an outside force, this inertia is of a particular kind. This outside force is actually inside. This outside force is not some kind of an asteroid, creating a sort of planetary collision that has suddenly put everything to a standstill. But the protagonist in this situation is a pathogen, and it's invading our systems and our processes and our weird and warped lifestyles and life cycles and everything else that's we've generated as species, all from within our bodies. And it's and I think that's what makes this peculiarly, I think a place where I think many of us would contemplate the contrasting scales of things. For instance, I was just reading somewhere that it takes something like 70 billion viruses to make a person sick. So, so if 4 million people fell sick, whatever these viruses, whatever they weigh, their collective weight would be barely 2 grams on the surface of planet Earth. So it's really 2 grams of matter of some kind of microscopic entity that can bring down, an entire species, for this moment. And I think this pause and stillness is so turbulent from within. It's still from the outside, and it's quivering and shaking from the inside, in terms of what it's done, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that's interesting. Again, the word matter, 2 grams of matter to make us rethink what matters, right? Or even, through stillness, you feel the motion around you or the commotion within you. It's it's very interesting times we're in. But to get into your work, I think it's interesting that you have this profound, here you're talking about the outside and the inside, but your work has this profound ability to blur what we might consider hard edges, right? So edges between there and here, between the past, present, and the future, the edges that divide our human species, the edges of our own agency, and the distorted or misconception of edges between humans and nature, since of course we know we are nature. And your work helps us to question what these perceived edges are as we think about our own interconnectivity through the work. I think you also do an amazing job of stretching and collapsing and expanding about how we think about time. So maybe when we start thinking about the edges of there and here and past, present, and future, maybe you could talk about a recent work of yours from the Covering Letter series, this Terranum Nuncius. I would love to hear you talk a bit about this, especially since, this was a work that it's 2019-2020, correct?
That's right. Actually, 2018 to 2020, completed, when the last bolts were fixed into the frame in 2020. But I think 2018 is when it actually really began to sort of begin to feel like there's something emerging there. It took a while through 2018, but yeah, I think that's really when it all actually began.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you're talking about extinction, like at a time before we've hit this moment. So it's really interesting, like today, to revisit this work.
Yeah, I mean, for me too, actually, ever since the exhibition opened at the Frisk Art Museum in March, of course, it subsequently has been temporarily shut down till it reopens. But ever since I returned after opening the show, I mean, we've just seen, I got into quarantine, the world went into lockdown. I mean, it's just, everything just unfolded, between the US and India. Of course, we saw a lot had happened in Europe and China prior to that. But, just returning back into the sort of solitude of this space, because I didn't go home when I returned. I just went into quarantine, and so those 14 days also meant that I was thinking about this work quite a bit, and I think what propelled me to sort of move with these images, which actually have been a preoccupation for a little while, were these sort of provocations that come from a shift in space and time. That happens when you think about things that are very far away from us in space and time. So, for instance, the images that make up the work covering Letter Terranum Nuncius are all images which one could think of as currently in interstellar space as an archive uploaded on these two discs, these phonographic discs called the Golden Records,
from 1977,
which were placed on the Voyager.
Correct?
1977, that's right, yeah. Placed on these spacecraft that depart planet Earth in 1977, hurtling away from us at 17 kilometers per second, and are currently in the outermost edge of the solar system, and are likely to go on this journey well beyond our extinction, possibly beyond the extinction of the entire solar system, because this thing may not decay. And I think just the extension of that thought of those distances, and returning back to a moment in 1977 when these images were composed, so to speak of a kind of summary of almost like an evidence of our life on planet Earth, a message that is sent to an interstellar other, to a species alien and far away from us, so distant from us in space and time that we have no properties to tell what this alien might be, and to me that, Diana, was quite a challenge to our own sense of creating instant otherness all the time as a species. I mean, what we are seeing unfolding in the United States at this moment, in India at this moment, in different parts of the world, is this sense of propping up the sense of the other by an imagined sense of self. But what happens when the other is so afar in space, time, that we don't have an other against which you might produce a sense of self? And to me, this question really led to the making of the work. So, Covering Letter Terranum Nuncius has this archive of images which sort of blink in and out of light. They almost at the speed of a calm human breath. They turn on and turn off. But in the space, you hear these sounds which are essentially 55 messages to the universe, which are essentially greetings in 55 languages. And the third element in the work is essentially these benches, which have been a preoccupation for a while. Benches that take the form of the hands of the doomsday clock. An image that again has preoccupied me, and I think has strange resonances at this moment.
Oh, absolutely. And maybe, I also thought that idea of the doomsday clock, like, we've been constantly pushing the edge of how much this planet and the universe can take of us, as a species. Could you maybe talk a little bit about, like, what the doomsday clock is, and also how it inspired, like, another work you and I discussed was Untitled 2 Minutes to Midnight, which basically, goes deep into our prehistoric past and far, again, into this unknown future.
Yeah, so the doomsday clock to me has been a very interesting I would say probably an image more than an idea, because scientists are typically meant to make claims which are falsifiable. They have to be either true or false. But in 1946, when the giants of 20th century physics, Fermi, Feynman, Oppenheimer, got together and produced the first hydrogen bomb, they almost felt that they had produced a species or an object that could actually bring down the entire planet. And in that sense of urgency, they announced this bulletin called the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, saying it's 7 minutes to midnight. And they're on taking the 7 minutes as a kind of a fixed number. They've been resetting the clock every year. And in the year 2018, the same year when I began conceiving covering letter Terendum Nuncius, but also the year that I made Untitled 2 Minutes to Midnight, the clock was set to 2 minutes to midnight because of climate change, nuclear threat, bioterrorism, and artificial intelligence. And all this cluster of these forces are clearly, like you said, pushing us to a point where we are having to now think about how far we push the planet. So in this sort of space of reflection, I think to me the doomsday clock then became almost like a resource that can either become a simple amenity in a gallery. It's a bench within my artwork that people can sit on to think about the work, or it can become a plinth in the case of Untitled 2 Minutes to Midnight, where the entire plinth on which these oversized hand axes, Paleolithic hand axes sit, take the form of the clock, and you only sort of realize it when you go around it, and perhaps only realize what it is when you probably read the wall text. But it's kind of, there's a staggering of how you might understand this form. In the Kochi Biennale, where this work was exhibited, the wall text had a little QR code that would then take you to the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, and if one wanted to go and think about it, you could. But within the space itself, it's really you walk into a place where there is this concrete plinth sitting in a concrete space that holds on it a form that kind of talks to this moment when perhaps we as a species begin to recognize our own possibility to alter another object outside of us. And you change a stone and it becomes a tool, and it becomes a kind of prosthetic to your intentions, and your strength and your capacity to alter the next object and the next object and thereon, until you reach a point where you transform the planet so much that you begin to contemplate your own extinction. So this piece, 2 Minutes to Midnight, sat between this image of announced apocalypse that comes from the world of science to this image that talks to the dawn of human ingenuity at some moment, a really beautiful moment that gets us into the crisis we are today.
Totally. No, it's funny. My grandfather was quite a character, and he used to like to say things like, here's a simple rule of thumb: too smart is dumb. But like that idea of like when we think that we're so adept, and so that idea of more, or having to conquer or accumulate, like I don't know, I'm rambling, but there's such a danger in that. And I think that the way that you juxtapose these two simple concepts of I guess time and the infinite and the finite with that clock, or the finite being us, and those tools which last far beyond the person that held them, but what did the actions of those people accumulate over time?
We often ideas of our death and mortality rarely really seem real to us, and I think somehow the fact that you see things that have longer life than you and announces your own having existed to an alien species in the future creates a kind of reflective loop within which I think we can really think about our present moment. So that's really how covering letter Terendum Nuncius emerged several years after the previous covering letter. So in a way it's only kind of created its own offspring after 7 years, in a kind of epistolary mode, the letter writing as a kind of way to, or correspondence as a way to think about the world.
Absolutely. And it's interesting you bring that up, because you've actually just hit, I have like 2 questions coming off of this. So let's go I love that idea of, understanding one's mortality through this idea of the universe. We can go to that in a minute, but back to covering letter. So your latest covering letter is talking to someone so far away that actually we can't even fathom what they look like. But your previous covering letter was also something that was very far away. It was something far away in ideology, but it was Gandhi and Hitler, who, like, again, we know what they look like. We have images for who these people were. And while their ideology seemed so far away, like, this was Gandhi's attempt to stitch something close to home. And I like some of that you talk about like utterances that echo far into the future. Could you maybe talk a bit about this? Because I think that actually these words on this letter is so relevant right now.
Diana, the covering letter, the previous one, sort of unfolds in the space with just a few things in the space. There's a shaft of light on which you see, fairly illegibly letters roll out on the ground coming towards you. But as you move closer to the what's at the heart of the work is this film of mist. And in the descending film of mist, you see ascending words. It's only when the words begin to scroll up that you realize that the author of the letter was Gandhi and the intended recipient was Adolf Hitler. And as you say, there's almost like this wide distance that this letter needs to journey to even connect from one sort of end of the spectrum of human possibility to the other end of the spectrum of the same human possibility. And I was actually kind of really at the heart of the work for me was this sort of viewer who here and now in this moment sort of completes that journey through the letter, kind of closing in on that, the triangulation between these two figures and the self, moving through a letter that sort of continues to atomize as one walks through it. It's kind of perennially descending but disintegrating at the same time. As you move through it, it breaks apart and falls again. And it's actually a work that, with every passing episode of our own, deviant action, and every new riot that emerges in different parts of the world. I mean, this work has just meant different things. I mean, I've been exchanging notes with, my curator friend Trinita Kennedy, where this work is currently being shown in the United States at a very complex time. And she's been talking about the kind of changed meanings, ever since it opened. The previous time it got exhibited at the Philadelphia Museum was at the end of a toxic election between Trump and the whole moment. It was 3 days after Trump came to power that this work was exhibited. Each time it's meant something else. I don't know. It's just, it's a work that changes meaning with time.
But that's so beautiful. Again, right? It's a work that's still, but it changes every time you show it, and it changes. I mean, every time I've experienced it. Again, the references that you bring from your own changing experience bring it alive in a different way. So maybe to go back a bit, this obsession with the skies, or like kind of charting ourselves against the sky. I really like this quote from your recent monograph, which was one element that's continued throughout from the earliest of works is this engagement with the skies, a place where it all begins, with light and energy and photosynthesis that becomes food, and the food that again becomes our bodies, right? I mean, it's a beautiful sentence about how you've basically been able to bring all of these ideas together through your work. So maybe we could talk a bit about a few works that extrapolate our terrestrial and mortal existence into the edges of the cosmos. So maybe we can talk about Epilogue and its relationship to 22,000 Sunsets, which, as you say, is a single utterance separated by a decade, sightings, or even further back, the forensic trail of the Grand Banquet.
That's... I mean, one of the things, Diana, in fact, I think, one as an artist, one is, of course, at all times aware that, it's a bit like the Zeno's paradox, where you realize that you want to get to a destination, but if you want to get to that destination, as Zeno says, you got to reach half mark. And before you reach half mark, you got to get to the quarter mark, and you got to make the journey to the 1/8 mark, etc., etc. So you might never begin the journey. Or if you are on the journey, you might reach half mark and keep going another half through infinity of halves where you'll never reach the end, right? So in a peculiar way, I think, in the search for insight, I think we as artists or as people who kind of try to generate either a text or an image or a sound, so that this sound or image can allow us to journey where through incremental steps we'll only be making endless half steps, and we would never get beyond half mark, or we'll never get beyond the next half mark. And somehow we look for pointers or prompts within ourselves, which would then become an image to prompt us further on, to take leaps which are not incremental into directions where insight might rest somewhere far away, And to me, this has only, led me to kind of realize in retrospect that that's what seems to be going on through several works, and it only became somewhat clear to me through the kind of survey of my work at National Gallery of Modern Art and through the making of the monograph, both which were kind of simultaneous processes, that when you look at large bodies of work, you see kind of tendencies, what was I doing there and what was I doing there, and you realize, I think, one thing that I often say is that we often do this to understand ourselves a little better in space and time. We think back and forth every day, or we look at objects, taking them close to us or far, and artworks can allow you to sort of extend that. And in a work like Sightings, for instance, what appears like interstellar imagery or sometimes intercellular imagery, either deep within the body or deep within a cosmic field, are nothing but images which are just inverting chromatically, just in terms of color. The image itself is that of a skin of a fruit, but as you move in front of it, it's flipping into its own negative, and in that negative inversion, there seems to be this eruption of imagery that point to perhaps where the fruit might be headed, or perhaps more clearly where the fruit comes from. And that sort of circulation that happens just from a simple shift in image is what I seek, Diana, in some ways. I want to try and reach spaces where simple shifts can occur that allows us to make larger journeys, and that's sort of, of course, when I make a work like 22,000 Sunsets, it at the time wasn't, I hadn't really spoken about the fact that this painting that I was making is essentially, about my father. I began painting it a year after he passed away. But it's only really 10 years later when a work like Epilogue happens, where 22,888 moons of his lifetime begin to talk back to a work, 22,000 Sunsets, which on the face of it appears like a group of people walking, each one having a thought or a speech bubble that has a setting sun in it. All seem to kind of interlace, and I think that's really how I think artworks come to you. They wait a while before they fully complete their utterance, and to me it only gets complete like 10 years later with Epilogue, what began as 22,000 Sunsets.
Totally. But I think that's also what happens when time isn't premeditated, right? Like, you kind of made those works for yourself. They're works that kind of embed, deep emotion and experience, and they can't be rushed on an external timeline.
Yeah, with Epilogue, even before I made the work, there was so much doubt and hesitation, because I didn't know whether, this was an impulse that I must say just erupted out of nowhere. Standing at, I was having this solo exhibition at Haunch of Venison in London. On two ends of a room were two artworks, one titled Conditions Apply, which was essentially a lunar cycle. At the other end of this space was a piece called The Cry of the Gland, where 108 shirt pockets become almost like a constellation of close images of sort of human bodies, where where essentially a pocket laden with objects almost begin to talk about something about the person whose face you cannot see. Now, in both these instances, I had never really thought about my father while I was in my studio. And standing while installing this exhibition in the gallery space, a kind of space where normally, you're not hoping during an install that you're distracted by insights into and doubts about where these works came from. But this was like a cascade of questions about, where are these images coming from? They both look like images of or portraits of my father to me, which made no sense to me actually at that moment. And it's only when I returned back to the studio that I began to think of, almost had this desire to see every moon that my father saw. Really pushed, I think, to think about conditions applies, image of the full moon and the new moon, one below the other, and this progressively eaten bread becoming cycles of fullness and emptiness, abundance and dearth, began to speak to me as the story of my father's life, where I knew that when I was making the work, I wasn't thinking of him remotely as something to do with the work, So when I came back, then I began to kind of look at every moon of his lifetime, and for about 8 months, they were just pinned up on my study's sort of wall as tiny images. And
I remember seeing them in the studio.
Exactly. In fact, I was about to say it's the studio where we first met, actually, 10 years ago or 11 years ago now, maybe, and that was a time when these were just kind of pinned up, and it took an entire cycle of a year until 2011 when I finally exhibited it, but without any pointer. There wasn't a wall text or any information as to what these images were. People walked into a labyrinth, and of course through hearsay and conversation realized that it's every moon that my father saw. But I also realized that when people left the gallery, they were actually leaving with, several of them had their screensaver changed with a moon of choice, whether it's a moon of a date special to them. And I realized that every artwork has 100 unforeseen stories that mean other things in some ways.
Well, absolutely. And I have to say that was seeing that exhibition, I wouldn't even say feeling that exhibition was like one of my most profound memories of my time in India. And, that reminds, when I see shows like that, that's why I love working with artists. It's like you said, that ability to just trigger this cascade of questions or a new way to situate yourself in the world via someone else's thinking.
Yeah, for me, epilogue was completely unforeseen set of steps which then led to becoming the work, and actually it's continued to mean so many other things along the way. But yeah. We talk about it a lot here in Bali, so we think about you whenever, so it's interesting. Bali, they measure, everything's measured by full moon cycles. So there's a full moon ceremony. So now I know, as of yesterday, I've been here for 4 full moons. So we think, anyway, your work is something that Bandhu and I come back to in this moment. But another word you brought up that I really love was this word interlace. And then also when we talk about the edge, I've been thinking a lot about what is the edge of my own agency? Where, we all have limits. What is that limit where you need something external to come in and interlace with you to I guess push you to a flying point on that edge rather than a crashing point on that edge? Do I make sense? Yes, yeah. I mean, I think this thing of something from the outside having to entangle with whatever we might think of the inside is a perennial situation. I think all kinds of creative and intellectual work that that something, any kind of material outside of itself, outside of ourselves, have this inherent sort of intelligence or its own insight to sort of correlate and entangle with something that might be an internal state. And I think we as creative practitioners, have to action this thing onto a material so that we can then have access to intuitions to understand the world, because we know that fundamental reality is not something we might be able to access through the next form that we create. That form is a separate thing unto itself, you know. All that form can do is give us intuitions to maybe find some other portal within ourselves to that fundamental reality. So in a way, we I think create a series of half steps. You know, I think I come back to Zeno again, but these are almost like half steps that, at least from the edge of that half step, you can look beyond. You know, and only when we are able to find that material do we find the edge. So many a times we are actually not even finding the edge. You know, we are actually kind of sort of navigating, we're just kind of moving, and the edge appears from time to time, and that's when we can look. You know, that's when we got to look really carefully. You know, and because it's the edge. You know, you don't find it often, really. You know.
Well, I like how you've kind of pushed this edge in your recent works that are collaborating. So it's funny that I'm listening to a rainstorm in the background while I'm talking to you. But these elemental drawings, right? Your wind series or your rain series, and how you basically, you know, you take your drawing and your synthesis of space and time to a certain element, and you bring in something that you fully cannot control to complete the work. I would love, and also in a way, like that process reveals or makes concrete something that we can't see, or what is like past the edges of our understanding without collaboration. So for example, wind directions, right? We can't, when we're sitting here feeling, you know, you're limited in how you can perceive the wind, yet your drawings open up a new view into that. Maybe could you speak a bit about these series of work?
Yeah, you know, Diana, for me, like the wind studies and the rain studies, I think transform the way I kind of want imagery to appear to me now. I mean, you know, I can't say want, because that's a very, very hard, you know, but you know, I've become progressively dormant, you know, in the act of trying to kind of reach to an image, you know, and I think I want to find the image halfway, you know, and I think these works have altered the way I paint. For instance, I hadn't painted for like half a decade, you know, between 2013 onwards until 17, 18. Really, there was this long gap when I didn't touch paint to canvas. And I think the wind studies...
And similar forms to what we find in your older paintings as well, right? Some of those patterns I can see in earlier paintings.
I mean, it all begins with a drawing inside a studio. Initially, they were just intuitive lines and circles.
And similar forms to what we find in your older paintings as well, right? Some of those patterns I can see in earlier paintings.
You know, actually, that's very true. And it is weird how, you know, one perhaps develops some kind of weird amnesia about one's own work. When Catherine David and I were, you know, working with a whole set of older images of older paintings, and we began to lay them out on a table, we started finding these forms, you know, which become molecular, constellation-like, in paintings made like 18, 20 years ago, you know, or even older actually, 1998, 99, is when we realized that we might just, at the retrospective maybe, or you know, with some kind of retrospective insight in a survey, put these things together, you know. So the wind studies then finally found companionship in very, very older paintings that had the same form. But you know, I wasn't thinking of this when, you know, 20 years later, when I began to just make sort of line drawings. But I think the work actually begins when I step outdoors. You know, once outdoors, I begin to lay one line at a time with this inflammable fluid and set it aflame. And as the sort of, you know, the fire sort of emerges from that line, also what begins to emerge for me is something that until that moment I cannot see. It suddenly makes wind visible through the movement of the fire. And I think it also makes visible to me the limits of my own perception right in that moment. You know, unless there's a strong rain or thunder like you're experiencing right now in Bali, you know, on a normal day, right now, you know, in the studio backyard, if I just step out, very little would tell me about where the wind is coming from. But every line that emerges from this drawing gives some kind of a precise movement of the wind at that moment, articulated through the other element, fire. And so this, I think this body of work, I think, has had a lot of bearing in the way I kind of also began to paint much later. The rain studies themselves actually have a long history, actually, much forgotten. Also that I have another curator friend to thank, Natasha Jinwala, because, thanks to the monograph, old photographs and albums and all began to emerge, from boxes. And we found these very old photographs of me making my earliest rain study in 2000 with thermal fax paper. That's not what I do now. It's, with the fax paper taken outdoors in the Laurentian mountains of Quebec, where Rina was invited on a residency and I was traveling along with her. I would step outdoors in the subtle drizzle of the Laurentian rain, take the fax paper outdoors, bring it back in and bring a fire close to it. Because of the heat, the thermal fax paper would go black instantly, except for the droplets of rain registered as luminous whites on that tiny sheet of fax paper. Once again, amnesia. I had forgotten this until these emerged in 2016. In the summer when Natasha and Roslyn and I were working on the monograph, and somehow when the rains came, I had the desire to, with the hindsight of the wind studies that began a year earlier, the desire to take paper outdoors and register the rain. And then these kind of almost interstellar kind of imagery began to appear from descending raindrops, and it began to close some kind of a loop again,
Yeah, I guess it's back to that edge again. Well, Jitish, it's been such a pleasure being in conversation with you, and I really hope that we'll be able to do it in person soon.
Yes, once this time passes, Diana, can't wait to connect. Really, I think we all need to sort of get out there, maybe move less, a little less than we did before.
Absolutely.